Here we are, man. Episode 12 of the Cozy Corner of Cinema. Ooh, man, I tell you, these days are getting more warm. It's pretty muggy out. I don't know if you can hear the fan on in the background, but gotta keep it going so I ain't totally drenched in sweat. It's beautifully sunny out, man. You can hear the birds outside. The cats are around. They're sleeping inside, enjoying the comforts that we provide. And this week has been pretty busy, man, I gotta say. Writing has taken a bit of a hit in terms of getting the time as well as reading, but that's okay, man. That's what we do. We go forward, we find the time bit by bit until it all comes together into a big center, man. Like I was saying last time, still going forward with the 1956 watches. I don't know if I said last time, but that episode will be up at the beginning of July. I Let's see, July 1st is on a Friday, man, so I gotta record this episode then, so I'll have to do that back to back. So it should be up that weekend, hopefully. July 1st to the 3rd, and, let's see. Okay, yeah, so that'll be the main idea. But the watches are going good, man. Been watching some good stuff lately that I hope to talk about if it makes the top 10. But keep an eye out for that. I'll mention it the next couple episodes. I got two more episodes, and then I can go ahead and start putting that all together. But like I was saying before with the writing, man, it's writing was, you know what, man, I gotta tell you, sometimes you gotta go back to go forward because finding the time this week has definitely been a little tricky. Got some stuff going on, got to take care of, man. Some things that must be achieved at a certain time and date. And I spent about an hour writing this sequence down of these characters meeting in a way that has to convey a specific emotion. And so I'm writing it. I spent an hour doing it, and I'm reading it back, and I'm going, all right, this is on a literal and technical level working, but something about it's not. What is it? And I had to do a thing that I think a lot of writers get a little apprehensive about doing, and that is just going back and just getting rid of it, man. Just getting rid of the entire sequence, and I'm sitting there with a blank page, going, man, I just spent all that time in it, and now I have nothing to show for it. So how am I gonna approach this? And so I sat there, and I was just thinking, and one word coming out at a time, and trying to approach the specific situation from a different angle. And I thought, okay, how about these characters meet in this way, where it's essentially the same sequence, but minor things are altered to overall change what happens, how these characters will act to one another. So I start writing it, and it's slowly coming together, and I'm reading it back, and it's not as much as I had written before. It's definitely like a small chunk before I had to do something else. But I was reading it back, and I was going, okay, this is gonna work, man. The quality of this sequence is going to be better in the long run and in the overall story rather than the way that would have worked before, but was less gratifying. And I think that way, I could sit back and go, oh, I wasted an hour because now I have nothing to show for it. But it wasn't a waste because it helped me realize a different way of going about that sequence and these characters. And that's what it's about, man. Getting the best outcome possible and learning from your mistakes. Because the way that I'm doing it now, the way I'm writing it, someone could read that back and go, you could have done it this way. And I go, yeah, man, you know what? You're right. And I do it that way and it's improved. So you always got to learn from yourself, man. Learn what's best to get the best outcome, man. I'm gonna get a sip of this coffee. We're gonna talk about some stuff today. So I'm gonna talk about two films, or about two films, not exactly the films themselves, but around them, or that are celebrating their 50th anniversary. Two films that I didn't even intend to initially talk about, but this past week has given opportunity to talk about them. So I have just finished reading the new book from author Mark Seal, Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli, all about the making of The Godfather. It goes into the pre-production, production, and release, and also about Charlie Bludorn, who came into Paramount, and Mario Puzo, who wrote the novel, and of course the background of director Francis Coppola. So I'm talking about that for a bit. And I'm also going to be talking about the 50th anniversary of the infamous, controversial, and groundbreaking 1972 pornographic film directed by Gerard Damiano, Deep Throat, starring Linda Lovelace and Harry Reams. And I'll go into that as well, talking about probably maybe my favorite podcast. I don't know, maybe one of my favorite podcasts. It may be my favorite, I don't know, but the Rialto Report, who specialize in the history of adult cinema and adult actors. And because this is the 50th anniversary, they've been doing some episodes and about the film. They've done episodes before in the past, and actually I'll talk about another episode that I listened to recently about Deep Throat, which was from a couple years ago when the film Lovelace came out. I'll talk a little bit about that, but anyways, we'll go into that in a little bit. But they had done an episode about what's his name? Jesus. Chuck Trainer, that's his name. I apologize. I still kind of waking up a little bit, which is funny because I've been up for a couple hours and still waking up. What does that tell you? But anyways, we're going to start off with Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli. So, like I was saying before, this is a book that's all about the production, the pre-production, the filming, and the post-production of The Godfather. So, a lot of it, it's like, it really feels like the first half is about the backgrounds, the pre-production. We go into a lot of the players. We have Charlie Bluhdorn, Robert Evans, Al Ruddy, you know, the people at Paramount. Al Ruddy was the producer at Paramount, was a producer at Paramount, and Robert Evans as well, and Charlie Bluhdorn, who was somebody who came in, because Paramount at the time, I don't know, I can give like a breakdown of like each part of the novel, because before I talk about it specifically, it's highly recommended, one you got to check out. But Charlie Bluhdorn came in because Paramount was at a lower point of this studio's legacy. They had a hit with Love Story, the Ryan O'Neal, Ally McGraw film, and Ally McGraw was married to Robert Evans. But they were getting a bunch of failures. They were just not doing well. They were in debt, and Charlie Bluhdorn is somebody who came in from other companies to fix the companies, and he didn't really know much about filmmaking or the films. But anyways, so this novel comes out, written by Mario Puzo, Mario Puzo itself is a very interesting character. He was somebody who had pretty much everything against him. He was somebody who was a writer, but was taking his time with it. And he had a couple novels before The Godfather that were not received the way he wanted them to. Basically, that they were just kind of, they were getting published, but they weren't really big hits for him. So his publisher, I think, was saying basically, why don't you write this simpler kind of story that will appeal to the general masses? And he very slowly wrote The Godfather. He really took his time with it, not to kind of make the details fine, but because he was, he would take the advances and go off and do things, and the publishers were really kind of adamant about, hey man, you got to get this novel out, and eventually he did it, and it becomes a huge success and what he's most known for now. And so Paramount, one minute, they get the rights to the novel, it becomes a huge thing. They hire young Francis Coppola, who had a small resume behind him. Not a lot of, not work to get a big project like this, which is actually, they still do that now. I mean, look at like Jurassic World. They have Colin Trevorrow, who directed Safety Not Guaranteed, and they give him this big film. You have Eternals, directed by Chloe Zhao, who does these smaller films like Songs My Brother Taught Me, The Rider, and Nomadland, and then they give her this big film. So, and then you have situations like Josh Trank with Fantastic Four, where I think he directed, that film The Kings of Summer, I think was him. I don't remember, but they gave him that film, and then actually that was a big just disaster, the production and all that. But so it's not like they don't do it anymore, but they basically gave him a chance. And I recently watched one of Coppola's first films he did. I think it was called what the hell is it called? The Bellboy and His Playgirls, I think it was called. something like that. It's in the Nudie Cutie collection that Kino put out, and a lot of those Nudie Cuties, I find the history much more interesting than the films themselves. I really wasn't a fan of the film, and they talk a little bit about the production of that and how he had to come back to it. It was made in parts, and but then he also worked, of course, with like Roger Corman and stuff. He did Dementia 13 and The Terror, and anyways, they basically got him because he was the closest. I won't go into the whole thing because of why they hired him and stuff. But anyways, he gets hired, and then the production is just everyone undermining. Well, let me say it this way: Robert Evans and Charlie Bludorn really undermining him. Al Ruddy is on Coppola's side for a lot of it. And actually, Al Ruddy, which I haven't seen the Paramount Plus miniseries of The Offer, but to my knowledge, I believe that Miles Teller in that, who is like closer to the lead, to my knowledge, I think he's playing Al Ruddy. And Al Ruddy is a very interesting guy in and of itself. And honestly, Robert Evans is very interesting too. I know the book paints him in more of an intrusive light, but I recommend the documentary "The Kid Stays in the Picture," which is about Robert Evans and his time at Paramount. And yeah, I mean, I think Robert Evans. I think was a smart guy and knew what he was doing, but the undermining of Coppola is really where really where a lot of the issues come in, because a lot of the things they mention in the book is how a lot of Coppola's decisions were undermined. They didn't want Brando. They definitely didn't want Pacino. Coppola really had to fight hard for Pacino, and really, if The Panic in Needle Park wasn't released, then it's very unlikely that Pacino would have been cast. But Brando, who was pretty much like, it was known for his attitude on set, and was in a lot of box office failures at that point. He was basically like a has-been, and you know, the whole story about the mob really undermining production, and actually it's funny how they talk about the Italian League of Defamation was basically started just from, I'm not getting into the specifics, but was basically I won't get into the whole thing, but the reason why that was formed is actually pretty funny, and the relationship that they had with Paramount was pretty funny, honestly. It's great. They talk about Al Ruddy having to go in and reason with some of the mobsters because they wouldn't let him film and stuff. I mean, it's one that I know that I think it's still happening. The Oscar Isaac film that's also about the making of The Godfather, which I think is coming out next year or something along those lines. I guess it's just a coincidence that, well, not a coincidence, but I guess it's just kind of funny. You have The Offer on Paramount Plus, and then you have the Oscar Isaac film where he's playing Coppola, I believe. And actually, the actor that got to play Coppola on The Offer looks a lot like him. That actor whose name I am blanking on right now. He was it's Dan Fogler, I believe, or I think that's his name. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But he actually looks a lot like him. You look at photos of Coppola at the time, and he's got a big beard. He's got like this big army jacket and stuff. And it's just crazy. You know, you're dealing with one part from the mob who want their stake in it, and like Frank Sinatra, who is very against it. You know, but his relationship as well is actually pretty funny. But you have that issue there, and then the issue at Paramount just being very problematic with a lot of their choices of undermining Coppola, where certain decisions they want him to do that he won't do. He's very adamant, and actually most of his choices actually remain in the film. And they talk about the original editor of the film. Actually, he was complaining that he couldn't edit the sequence, the restaurant sequence, the shooting, and how he got fired, I think, by Coppola, and they hired somebody else. And it's very interesting how Coppola, you know, pretty famously was almost fired a handful of times, and how you know, Brando went to bat for him, and Brando was actually on his side, and their relationship is very interesting too. It actually paints a very interesting, very humanistic portrayal of Brando, man. Somebody who is known for his on-set behavior and his difficulty, but the book paints Brando in a way where Coppola knew how to work with him and get him to do what he wanted to, because Brando was not, to my knowledge, I mean, he was getting older, so he was having trouble memorizing his lines, and they talk about they had to, like, you know, write a lot of his stuff on cue cards, and that you mentioned that Brando really kind of I think at one point said that if Coppola was fired, then he was going to leave as well, and really kind of putting his foot down. Now I don't know the exact reasoning why Brando wasn't in The Godfather Part 2 in that one flashback sequence at the end of the film. Which, I mean, it does kind of, it actually in the specific moment of the film works, because it adds, it's kind of a good finale to that sequence, which is one of the best sequences in either film. But that flashback sequence when Michael says he's going to war, and the relationship there at the table with Sonny, and the whole book is just endlessly fascinating. Like I said before, I think I said before, the first half is about the backgrounds of everybody, the pre-production, and then the second half is about the filming, the pure stress that Coppola was going under. He was just, the fact that, I mean, you read this and knowing, about the filming and just about Apocalypse Now, when that would come, it's sort of like, this is a guy who, if you could easily have just said this guy was going to have a heart attack at the time. He was under so much stress and disdain, and everybody was against him at Paramount, and it's just funny how Paramount, well, at least most people were. I mean, like, Al Ruddy was on his side and stuff, but it's just funny how Paramount does everything to try to undermine him, and then all these years later, they talk about how proud they are of the film. And actually, yesterday I was eating lunch and watching, I think it was a GQ video that was, like, Coppola talking about some of his famous films. So he just talked about the Big Four. He talked about Godfather, Godfather Part 2, Conversation, Apocalypse Now, and he talked a little bit about Megalopolis at the end, which is apparently filming in August. But he said that, like, on Godfather Part 2, it basically was a much smoother shoot, because they basically just let him do what he wanted to do, and we know how the Godfather Part 2 turned out. But it's funny reading this book about this big, elaborate production, and ultimately it pays off. I mean, The Godfather is one of the most famous films in history, but it's funny how I mentioned, I was talking about the Michael Cimino book a little while ago about the production of Heaven's Gate and how everything went wrong, and then that film turns out to be a critical and financial disaster, and pretty much it has that effect on the studio and on Cimino's career after that. It's just very interesting, the total opposites of this. I mean, I've said it before, but Coppola really is one of the true genius artists of the 20th century. And I've always said this, that it's one thing if you make one of the greatest films of all time, but the fact that he made 4 films that are not just great films, but are 4 of the greatest films of all time in the span of a decade. And that's pretty crazy. It's sort of like, no matter what he does after the fact, that work alone is remarkable. If he made one of those 4 films, it'd be one thing, but the fact that he made 4 is insane, And it's interesting, going back to the GQ interview, hearing him. Oh, he also discusses Coda, the death of Michael Corleone, and it's interesting as well how when he talks about how he didn't have the same power that he had at Paramount at the time, from The Godfather Part 2 to the final chapter, but how he didn't want to call it Part 3 because he didn't consider it Part 3. Him and Mario Puzo wanted to call it Coda, which has since been released at home. And, I mean, ultimately, I'm of the mindset that Coda doesn't work regardless. I think, for one, that, I mean, knowing the story, that Coppola needed the money, so he was doing projects like Bram Stoker's Dracula and The Godfather Part 3. It's sort of like, the book, and let me say, the book doesn't talk about it only goes up to the end of The Godfather, where it wins the Oscars, and everyone at Paramount is happy. Coppola gets his legacy. It doesn't go into anything after that. But in the book, it does talk about some of the talks about The Godfather Part 3 and some of the stories that it was told by, I forget who at Paramount. It was somebody at Paramount or somebody else who was told. Some of the stories that was told were eventually implemented in the film. And I mean, that's the thing, is that, like, I mean, I'm going completely off topic here, but yeah, I mean, Coda just doesn't work at all. I think where the characters end up in, where specifically where Michael ends up at the end of both films, it's perfect in a way where you really didn't need The Godfather Part 2 because the ending of The Godfather was so chilling, but it works because we see how far he has gone, and then eventually when you get to the ending of The Godfather Part 2, where he is at and what he has done, without spoilers, I mean, he is completely gone at that point. He does something at the end of The Godfather Part 2, which is one of the most shocking moments in either film in terms of a character's decision, and the imagery of it is amazing. The final shot of The Godfather Part 2 is amazing. So when you get to Coda, I mean, I see where they're coming from. I see where Coppola and Puzo were coming from with having a older Michael, having him be, I don't know, even his relationship with Kay in Coda is like, I don't know, man. With the thing with Coda is that it's more, I kind of just want to act like it doesn't exist, because the shutting of the doors on Kay, specifically at the end of The Godfather, and then at the end of The Godfather Part 2, both mean different things, because Kay is a character who has always been on the outside of Michael's life, and both of those images of the door shutting on Kay is so powerful and specific. So having her come back in Coda, I get it. It's a character who's at the end of his life, realizing that the people around him are dying. He's having regrets about some choices, and he's not as cynical as he was. It just doesn't totally work for me. I think it could work, but in context, knowing what we know about that character at that point, it just doesn't come together, man. It really just feels like at least that version of Michael. If Mario Puzo wanted to write a Coda, I'm fine with that. I know he wrote the screenplay. I'm talking about specifically Al Pacino's version of that character. It doesn't work, and if you were to watch that, not as Part 3, but even as that Coda version, it doesn't come together, and it feels so far removed from the other two versions. And maybe that's in part because it is 20 years later, whereas, The Godfather 1 and 2 are only a couple years apart. So you have that mindset, but everything about it feels very too little too late. This isn't a story that, I'm not going to say it couldn't have gone on, let alone in the way that it did, but it doesn't feel like, even with Coppola explaining his Coda release of it, it doesn't feel like him or Puzo's entire heart are in it. At the end of The Godfather Part 2, a film that Coppola didn't even really want to make, or at least didn't want to direct, he said to Paramount they should get like a young director to do it, and they rejected that, which is kind of funny, because he says that he was hired because he was a young director with a not the great resume. He's only made a couple films, none of which were enough to warrant him getting The Godfather. But it is interesting. But yeah, that's kind of how you got to look at it, at least how I look at it. I mean, I've seen Part 3, I've seen Coda, and I feel kind of the same way about him. The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 are miracles of filmmaking. Let alone, I think The Godfather more especially, because everything was going against it, and the fact that it not only is a masterpiece, that alone would be good, but the fact that it's one of the greatest pieces of art in the history of mankind, which is how I look at it. It's one of the closest examples I could even say to a perfect film, where there's nothing wrong with it. In the span of 3 hours, there is not a single frame, a single line of dialogue, a single performance that is not good. There's very few films can go into that perfect category. There's films that I like more than The Godfather, but when I look at The Godfather, I look at it like the Mona Lisa, like a Michelangelo and painting. It's just sort of like this perfectly put together just piece of art that couldn't have been made at another time. And The Godfather Part 2, goes without saying, is one of the greatest films of all time. It's obviously goes without saying, but I have always resonated more with the first Godfather, maybe because I've seen it more, but having recently rewatched both of them with the recent 4K Blu-rays that Paramount had put out, it really was apparent to me how perfectly constructed The Godfather is, and how how The Godfather Part 2 is as a film, where it's like, it's a different kind of film, but it's still masterful in the way it does it. And that goes with saying, I don't want to make it sound like I'm even remotely trying to put The Godfather Part 2 on a lower echelon, because I'm really not. I don't think it's fair to really compare them. But it's like, I get when people say The Godfather Part 2 is the film they like more. To me, I just think that the story of The Godfather is a little is more well crafted. But The Godfather Part Two is masterful in its own right. I mean, that is one of my all time favorite films, undoubtedly, and the emotion that the characters go through from the first film, the downfall, the downfall in terms of Michael as a person, of how far he's come, is genius, and the I mean. I'm not going to go into the whole thing with The Godfather Part 2, but I'm just saying that The Godfather itself is something else, and I think is why it stood the test of time, because these sequences and Coppola's vision Coppola and Puzo's vision is something that can only have been done at that time. I don't think we could ever get a film like that now, in terms of this epic like that. A film that, which is funny because even in the novel, they talk about cutting it down to, I think, like 2 hours and 20, I think, and even Robert Evans is saying that it doesn't work. And it's interesting in the last part of the book to talk about some of the back and forth between the editing when it comes to Robert Evans and Coppola, where Evans was taking credit for the version that we have now, but Coppola was saying that Evans, all he did was put the footage back in that he cut out. So the book doesn't really make a say on who did what. I'm kind of more inclined to believe Coppola, just given everything I've read. But, I mean, film is a collaborative effort. It's not solely one person. So, I mean, everything put together, it's a team of people putting together a piece of art. And I think that it shows on screen, just this collaborative effort and this Coppola's persistence of the vision has come through on screen. And I just realized now that I'm almost out of time for the episode, and I never even talked about Deep Throat. So we're going to actually save that for next week, man, because I'm keeping on with the 1956 watches, so obviously I'm not going to be talking about any recent films I've seen, but next week I'm going to go more talking about Deep Throat. I'll devote the episode to that like I did this, because I didn't mean to talk about it for this long, and I have plenty more to say about The Godfather and the book, which, I mean, goes without saying that it's highly recommended. I mean, it's sort of like, even if it'd be interesting to show this book to somebody who hadn't seen the film. If you look at it as just the story of this guy coming into the studio, is mostly an inexperienced director with a studio that was trying to bounce back, but everything was going against him. Just the money, the mob, everything was going against him. The fact that it just turned out to be what it is, and it's a staple of pop culture in general is kind of remarkable. It's a pretty amazing story, and I'm very curious about the film that's going to be made about it. And I don't know what the reactions to the author have been, the Paramount Plus miniseries, but I mean, it looks interesting. I've seen some clips of it, but it's a very interesting story, and especially now with it being the 50th anniversary, I say give this book a read, man. It's very terrific, very well written, and it's just, having just rewatched The Godfather maybe a couple months ago when the 4K came out, it made me want to watch it again. It's a film that I could watch again and again, because it's just perfection, man. It's truly perfection on screen, and it's a film that if I ever met someone who said they didn't like it, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I just think that there'd be what else we're gonna talk about, man. It's one of the films I just don't understand not liking it, man. Even if you don't love it, hey man, that's fine, but not liking it, not respecting it, it's just sort of like I can't even see your point of view, man. It's one of the most perfect pieces of art in the history of mankind, and I'll stand by those words. But I'm running out of time, guys. I hope you're all doing well and working hard. And if you haven't been working hard, I hope that you are at least finding joy in these days coming forward. The year is getting hotter, man, but we're going to pull on through. We're going to get the work done, man. Or if you're in a part of the world that doesn't have heat, well, then I hope this time of the year you're getting that summer mindset, listening to music that puts you in that mindset. I know I have been, getting the reading done, getting films done, and I just hope that it's all going well for you. So thank you for listening to another episode, and I hope you join in next week. We're going to talk about Deep Throat and the legacy that it's had. So all the best, guys and girls.